Bon dia. There's a reason they keep me in a basement with deceased people. I don't do a lot of public speaking because I find it difficult, but I am very grateful to be here. And thank you for the invitation. And translators, you are amazing. So thank you as well. So um, I'm just going to, so I am coming to you from the UK, and I will be representing. I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I am here to essentially share with you some of the things that I have that I deal with on a regular basis in my role, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So this talk will be about some formal issues, but also a little bit about sort of a kind of me sharing my story because I've worked with the deceased for 30 years now, and I know that might be hard to believe because I look so young, but it's true. So I have dedicated my life to being an osteoarchaeologist, to being a museum nerd, to being a death practitioner, and so I'm very happy to be here, even though I do often hide out in a basement. So what is my role? My role, my students call me the Empress of Death, which I think is quite funny, but I'm not that at all. So I am the curatorial manager of the Duckworth Laboratory, which is a very large collection at the University of Cambridge in England. I'm not British. You can probably tell from my accent. I'm a Californian. Thank you very much. So the Duckworth is essentially an amalgamation of many collections. We care for around 18,000 human remains, archaeological and anatomical. We have a non-human primate collection, so over 300 non-human primate remains, 400 fossil casts, fossil hominin casts. We also have a blood, hair, and brain collection, plus an archive for biological anthropology that really spans 300 years of collecting history at Cambridge. I am the only full-time person for the collection, but we do have a wonderful team of a part-time director, technician, and administrator. So it is a group effort. But the collection, that's Dr. Duckworth in the bottom there. We've also got collections from so many museums in Cambridge. The Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology has deposited their collections, zoology, earth sciences, many hospital collections. You might recognize, I know it's kind of a small slide, I apologize, but you might recognize some names like Petrie if you work in Egypt, or Pearson if you work in eugenics. So Louis Leakey if you work in Africa, Radcliffe Brown, Andaman Islands. So it is a very broad collection. Most of the collections are British in origin, but also Egypt. But we do have collections from all over the world. So Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific, the Americas, Africa. So there's a lot to do there. So when I talk about these things, at Cambridge, I also teach a little bit on repatriation, treatment of the dead, osteology, and politics and ethics. It's something that I write a lot about, but it's really working with students that I really enjoy. And I think some of the themes coming from a UK perspective, and I've been in this role for many years, but I've been, like I said, working in museums for 30 years in different types of collections. I am an osteoarchaeologist by training as well. So, but the things I like to point out, especially with European institution, is there is a long history of collecting and displaying bodies and body parts, and particularly skulls. And, you know, skulls, I mean, I'm covered in them, but that's me. You know, they do serve as actors, sometimes as inspiration. We can contemplate vanity and mortality, and historically, that's what we've done. 20th century displays were aligned with exploration and classification of nature and biology. And of course, there's scientific racism. Of course, now, and in the past, there was also commodification of the dead. And these are things I'm going to talk about. So these are the things, again, that I have to deal with every day I go to work, thinking about this. And I love thinking about it, actually, but it is overwhelming at times, too. So with this, historically in Britain, with this sort of collecting fervor, if you will, there was also this sort of publicized fear of death ghosts, spirits, what we also refer to as corpse aversion, out of, avoiding the corpse out of fear of disease contamination. And this kind of sets this tone for distance between human remains and object. And that's something that I talk a lot with students about. And death for me, I mean, death is omnipresent, how communities engage with death, how you engage with death, how it's displayed around the world. I've got examples here of King Richard III and his big burial procession in England. Growing up on the border of Mexico, Dia de los Muertos is something that's very important to me. But looking at how especially cultures in Latin America look at death and the history of that from the Aztecs, let's say, and up into the Spanish arriving on the coastal shores of Mexico and Lima and places like that. The sort of, I think, thinking about how we engage with death as well, how we display it, again, for a long time, say for the Enlightenment, we're talking about the corpse and looking at the corpse on display. For example, at the Vatican, this was supposed to create this sort of enrapture and this rapture and sort of religious piety and control. Other cultures display their dead for ancestor worship or just for respect, and to continually engage with people. How you feel about death, how we feel about death is deeply personal. It's deeply philosophical. How you were raised, what kind of religious background you have, if any. What was your first experience of death? I mean, look, at 15 years old, I was a teenager obsessed with archaeology, and then I experienced death massively, significantly in a short 3-month period. And undoubtedly, those experiences, I had 3 traumatic deaths in a row. It definitely set me on the course to become a human remains specialist and to want to look into treatment of the dead. So it is deeply embedded in our culture. So are we biomatter? Are we a taboo? Are we an ancestor? What are we? It very much is deeply philosophical. And I have to say that after thousands of conversations that I've had about this topic, it's hard. We have a professional responsibility, but those personal biases can come out, especially around death, because it affects us all. So I think it's something that I really enjoy talking about. It's something I really like to, ponder. And I like to play devil's advocate too sometimes. But I think there's a lot of interesting issues in ethical decision making about how we work with human remains. Again, is really based on our institutions. And I really enjoy this picture. I used to work at the Smithsonian at the National Museum of Natural History, and this is Dr. Grover Krantz and his dog Clyde. And Dr. Grover Krantz was a prolific physical anthropologist who was staff member at the Smithsonian, also a very big advocate for studying Bigfoot or Sasquatch, if you're in the Americas. And he actually donated, obviously, him and Clyde's body to the collection and wanted to be on display, and he's now on display in what's called Curious, which is the science education center, which is geared towards families. And I think this is really special. And every day when I would go to work, I used to walk by them, and at lunch I'd see all these children around looking at them, and parents and children having these incredible conversations about death, sometimes for the first time, because they're looking at these remains. Now, this is a great concept about consent, because he gave his consent to actually do that. And something that the students that I work a lot with are really interested in debating about consent. And I think I can't unpack all of that here, obviously, but it is something that we think a lot about. And if you think about, again, like with the case of Charles Byrne, he's made his wishes known, but they hadn't been written down. And that was for a while part of the reason why there was some debate about what would happen to his remains. He still is in the Hunterian collection. He's not on display, but there are also communities modern communities that actually have I can never say that word, but a form of giganticism as a community in Britain who would actually make a yearly trip to the Hunterian to actually see Charles and to sort of connect with his body. And they still have the ability to do that behind the scenes, just not on display. So I think it's really interesting. And in Britain, there's been, again, centuries actually of engagement with the dead. And I love this image, the dance of death, the vision of skulls, and this quote, "As it appears, though dead so long, each skull is found to have a tongue." And I think that's really interesting. And I say centuries because even into the Iron Age, back into the Iron Age in Britain, people were manipulating the body, secondary burial. So through archaeology, we know that there was sort of a movement of bones. And I saw this firsthand in a Neolithic tomb that I excavated in Ireland, where body parts were not in what would be considered a traditional anatomical position. You know, phalanges were mixed over here with spine, and legs were all around, and skulls were placed specifically in a quadrant. I mean, there was definite a design to that. So I say centuries because, again, we have a long history of engaging with the dead, and charnel houses in Britain as well, catacombs. And I really appreciate that. I think the human skeleton is a remarkable entity, and that they can give us such incredible information, direct evidence about the past, not only on a population level. Sorry, I usually pace when I talk, so I'm trying to keep myself in place. Not only on a population level, right, through demographics, but also on this intimate, personal level of what kind of trauma did they have? What kind of, how did disease manifest on them? Did they have any broken bones that then, healed? Or how tall or how short were they? We can look at the history and evolution of disease, gender roles, and social differences. One that I'm particularly interested in is social inequality, because you can see this in the past and you can see this today. And I think this ability to bridge the past and the present through skeletons is really interesting because, for example, we talk a lot in archaeology about elites and non-elites, right? And there's a lot more going on in the middle, in the middle there. But discrepancies, for example, in funeral care, that is a very big problem today. Financially, access to resources, racism in the funeral industry, all of these things were happening in the past. And we can see that in archaeology, we can see that in archival records, we can see that in history. And I think that, for me personally, is one of the reasons why I think working with human remains is such an important thing to do. And I really love looking at, I know I say love a lot. Look, I'm from California. You can take me out of the state, but you can't take California out of me. But I didn't bring any crystals today, so don't worry. But we can look at cause of death, dentition, trauma, occupational stress, and now this incredible work on hormones and metabolomics, looking at, smoking in the past and how our bodies adapt and change. I find it remarkable personally. And I love this idea of building osteobiographies because I think I am a scientist, believe me. I do biomolecular work, and I do conservation work, and I do my own types of isotopes in DNA, and I'm learning proteomics. But so I do subscribe to that. But I just love the idea too about these. It might sound provincial, but these stories coming out of the bones, and I really like this idea of osteobiographies, and I like that osteobiographies can bring more people into the past narrative. I mean, look, I did my fieldwork in Peru. I worked on a massive Inca necropolis, and I read a lot of chronicles from Spanish references and things like that, where you would say, quote, "That was women's work, so we'll pass over it." Now, I'm not, I mean, this is, man the hunter, woman the gatherer. We have these black and white distinctions, but they're not that at all. And we know that from doing anthropology and archaeology. But children and women, there's a lot of people that have been kind of left out of some of these bigger narratives. And I think diversity in Roman Britain, Nicholas mentioned our colleague who got a lot of bad press around just stuff like that, or African origin people in the Roman Empire. I mean, we know these things were happening. We know people were being moved around. And so there's a lot of, it's our job as osteoarchaeologists, to kind of talk about these things because they're making headlines elsewhere. I'm obsessed a little bit with this reconstruction of what is known as, quote, the shaman from Mesolithic Sweden. I just think this reconstruction is fantastic, but I love this idea of of a woman shaman. And yes, we're seeing more of this. No offense, guys, but we are seeing more female representation, child representation, intersex representation in the archaeological record, not so much in reconstruction. So I just like to highlight this particular one because this is an amazing role. Were they in fact a shaman? I mean, that, I think is really quite interesting in DNA and doing sort of tissue analysis. So looking at a lifespan of people through their tissues, their dental enamel, their femoral bone. These things are really interesting to me, and looking at a life course for people. And I think it, just presenting that to the public is really important. We look at things like burial deposition. These are all, so like I said, I worked in Peru, so a lot of my talks tend to be about Peru, but we can look at things about how people at death, and Valeria has just given you an exquisite talk about that moment of death. And here you have examples of, someone who's been quite cared for, and the body has been put in this seated, flexed position, headdress, textile, algodón, right? All of these things are on the body, whereas you have these other folks at Huaca de la Luna in Peru, where one person is laying face down in the middle there with their hands tied behind their back. Very different kind of deposition, very different kind of death. And I think those things are incredibly important, again, to talk about, especially with students who are coming to archaeology and osteoarchaeology and interested in past people's lives. I know I'm talking a little bit quick because I know we're over time, but if anybody's struggling, let me know. Things that I deal with on a regular basis in my role: curation and conservation. And all of this is done through ethical frameworks, and I'll talk about that next. But essentially, looking at, doing archival research, colonial connections, looking at, bones and what's been done to them in the past, like writing NU-219 across the head. We don't do that anymore. Using different types of technology, for example, like CT scanning, where in that image of the tooth, you can kind of see this fissure in the enamel. And by doing that, it tells me that when I go to sample that tooth, actually, there's a little bit of a fragment on the side that might just pop off really easily. It might just come apart really easy rather than having to destroy the whole tooth. So doing preventative and looking at sort of sort of CT work and X-ray work to kind of, before we decide to do sampling. These are just some of the things that we do, and repatriation is a huge part of the Duckworth now. I have several claims going at this moment, so there's a lot of work to be done. I use a lot of different, in Britain we have a lot of different publications. Well, these are global actually, but Nicholas brought up this one from the British Museum as well, which is really good if you need information on conservation. But there are a lot of really great guides too that I use regularly in my role as a curator, and many of them are free, which is wonderful. So you have sort of the standards of how to excavate skeletons, Science and the Dead, which is really interesting for scientific analysis. The key one for us, I don't know if this is this guidance for the care of human remains in museums that is specific to the UK, which talks a lot about environment and temperature control and ethical. They're all sort of ethical architecture. What they don't necessarily prepare you for, though, is when, let's say, you're in the museum doing some outreach with some bones, and a little boy comes up to you and starts to tell you about how he just went to his grandmother's funeral, and asking you very amazing questions about how decay works, how decomposition works, and having a rather matter-of-fact conversation about death. Or the happy 85-year-old who says, "Would you like my skeleton for your lab?" Or the gentleman who's just arrived from a war-torn nation, who's quite frightened by what he's just seen on your table because he's just seen death all around him. This is important, and the public audience is important, and there's a lot of misinformation being spread out there right now. And so we can do that, but these guidance don't necessarily tell you how to do that. Or when someone's come to do a repatriation ceremony, and you become the focal point of all of their mistrust and their hurt and their anger and their frustration, rightfully so in many cases, especially in Britain. you cannot prepare for that without having community to speak to about this stuff. I rely very much on people like Valeria and Nicholas to help me and to talk things through. And I think, and now here too, I hope. So we have a lot of British regulations in the UK. The Human Tissue Act, which Nicholas mentioned earlier, is in particular the legality. And this is, to sum it up really, is if basically that if you have this 100-year mark, so remains that are over 100 years old versus remains that are under 100 years old, they are going to be treated differently, and you have to be a licensed institution. So this is really around anatomy, medical practice, but for archaeology, we have to think about it as well. And every couple of years, the Duckworth is audited by the Human Tissue Authority, and they quiz me on everything on my list, and I have to show them where these remains are. And we aren't actually a museum, we're an institutional collection, and we don't have exhibitions necessarily. So these are just some of the, and they've also developed these codes of practice, which are ethical codes about anatomy and public display. So there is this framework, but then what you put in the rest of the building really kind of comes, I believe, in a case-by-case way. And that's what we have to deal with at the Duckworth. And I think it's really important from a UK perspective. You know, European institutions have been displaying material culture of many countries, and it's long been associated with empire and imperialism and social control. The story of exploration is wondrous, right? You have glittering treasures brought back to your institution, and museums are actually filled with the spoils of death, actually, whether it's the shiny grave ornaments, you know, the jewelry coming out of a grave, paintings of death on the maiden from the 18th century on your walls. It is omnipresent, but there's also a dark side to it, and that is often through mechanisms such as kidnap and murder, and really difficult collecting situations. There was an unequal status. We do have to think about sacred and secret objects. Human remains in general are a little bit different than, say, perhaps pottery in a lot of cases. And then now, with the sale of human remains, we're seeing this all over again, where we have modern situations where human remains are being sold, raffles are happening, and this is something I do with my Babio hat on, and I think you mentioned that I coordinate this task force on tracking the sale of human remains online. Repatriation is just one of the practical ways of doing the work, and that's something that we talk a lot about. And in Britain, we do have to talk a lot about how bodies and collections were actually created. You know, many collections, for example, in Britain, like the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Smithsonian in America, many large-scale collections were built on the bodies of the displaced people, of the poor, of the disfigured, of the disenfranchised, of the sick, of the criminal. Archival records often have many stories about grave robbing, exploitation, mistreatment of individuals. And this is a cartoon. I know it's kind of hard to see this, and I apologize, but these are balloon bubbles. These little speech bubbles have things like, "Aye, ye, where's me leg?" Or, "Oh, ye, I'm missing another rib. It must be with my wife." There's sort of a William Hunter. This is kind of a mockery of William Hunter, who was an avid collector. And this imagery is him with all these people who are missing body parts because people were dismantled. And we have to talk about that. And I don't think it's a problem. I think we should be talking about it. Why not? People need to understand what they've come to see, and I don't think that's the end of the world. The display of the corpse is often cited by a lot of Indigenous activists, sort of, again, about this sort of colonial authority and the ability of Europeans to obtain control over uncharted worlds. And this is a case where we have an Andaman, and for example, this is something that I think about a lot with, we have an Andaman Island young woman wearing the skull of her ancestor. This was a ritual to essentially prevent sickness, and she's wearing the skull of her sister. Now, how did that skull get in, or cranium really, get into the Duckworth? These are the things that I find, like in these moments, going from A to B, how do we think about this through archival research? osteological research. You know, you can see sort of on the side of her head that there's all this writing on there about the whole story of how Admiral so-and-so brought her to England and gave her to the anatomy department. I mean, but what was that negotiation like? I may never know, but these are the kinds of things that I have to think about a lot in my role. And the next image is really, I'm just going to put it up for a moment, but I just want you to take a look at it, and then I'm going to cover it up because I personally find it very sensitive, and I know people get upset, but I think it explains why we need to be talking about ethics. People were hunted like wild animals. People's heads were put on display like a giraffe or a rhino. Okay, so these are things, again, you may not have to deal with this here, but I have to deal with this regularly. And so these remains, these collections, you know, this whole collection of Maori ancestral remains was sold for $1,000 to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, $1,250, excuse me. So this is why I have to think about ethics a lot, because how do these collections come in? And of course, people, when they see these images, of course, communities are going to say, hey, hold on a minute. Let's talk, wait a minute, let's talk about this. Some of my colleagues are quite shocked still to this day about how much is involved in repatriation and this idea of loss. And I understand that, but no wonder people want their ancestral or human remains back. There's a difference, to be fair, in the terminology, but no wonder. But also, you know, I just find that through some of the most difficult conversations come the most remarkable relationships. And so I don't always look at it as a loss. Now, look, I have a lot of experience with that, whether I was working in San Diego in California or Peru or Cambridge or Washington, D.C. It's just something that I've had a lot of conversations with people about. And I think it is hard work sometimes, but it's our job to do it if you're in this role, in my opinion. And in a UK institution, we're all kind of navigating this, you know? So another thing that I think is quite interesting, and let me know if I go over, I think I'm doing okay so far, but you know, is now we're having these really interesting conversations. Something that I'm really keen to kind of dive into more too are things like prosthetics, casts, death masks. Now, there's been some discussion, especially around prosthetics, about whether or not they are human remains because they absorb your, you know, your sweat and other things. They absorb your essence. And I know this is just kind of my wild brain going all over the place, but you know, with casts that are made directly from someone, for example, the Venerable Bede, who's an incredibly famous religious figure in the UK, you know, when I brought this cast to the exhibition up in Durham Cathedral, I actually wore, this is bad, I had to carry him up to the cathedral. I had to take a train. I kind of wore him on my front like a baby. But when I brought him to the cathedral, people were like, Bede is here, Bede is here. There was so much excitement about seeing this cast of just his, you know, cranial top there. So I think these are some interesting things that I've been thinking a lot about. When it comes to things like, Nicholas already talked a little bit about destructive sampling, excuse me, and I think it's really interesting to think about that because that's something we get a lot. We have a lot of researchers using the collections. We do a lot of analysis like that, and for a lot of communities, whether they're global indigenous communities or even local British populations that I work with, you know, they have a sense of what archaeology is. And this is the excavation I spent many years at in Peru, outside of Lima, and there's a mummy bundle here. You can see how close to the surface the excavation was. We've got some Inca walls. This is a massive necropolis. So this idea of archaeology is one thing. And then you're like, human remains, okay. So in this case, here's a mummy mask, some fake hair. It's an over-modeled mummy bundle. Okay, they've got that idea in their mind too. And then they've got this idea of a skeleton, perhaps, maybe an ancestor, maybe just human remains. But what they don't have an idea about is this: pulverized human bone, pulverized human teeth in foil packets, in little baggies labeled with numbers. Now, the first return I had to do at Cambridge wasn't even with the Duckworth. It was actually over samples. And to show someone, to give people a box that says, here you go, where their mind is set on sort of a skeleton, maybe not, here's a whole bunch of femur, skull, like ground up. Here's your ground up ancestor. Now, I am pointing this out in a little bit of an extreme way, but that's how they were received. It was shock. It was absolute shock. And so it's just, again, I do destructive sampling, but this is depending on the population, but I think just in general across, we need to think about how our research is then perceived. And this is a shock, and this was a shock for these people. And I think that's something that we just need to have in the back of our minds, personally, because it's really hard and not everyone necessarily understands the process. And we need to be better at communicating what it is that we're doing. And I feel really strongly about that. Now, I often kind of look at this branch, which is wider than ethics, which is axiology. And this is a great book on that. And what I really like about this, and I'm doing all right on time, aren't I? Okay, cool. Sorry. Is this idea of relational accountability, communality of knowledge, reciprocity, and benefit sharing. I love that we are a collective. I think of this as a collective, osteoarqueologists, museum people. We get to do extraordinary things, and we get to work with the public, we get to work with each other, we get to work with communities, and I like this collective mentality. And unfortunately, for a long time, that just didn't exist. It was me and the other, it was us and the other, and again, that kind of collecting where I've read letters where medical Dr. X has written explicitly that he went into the morgue in the middle of the night to remove the head of Indigenous person Y, and is now sending it to Admiral Z off to go to somewhere. I mean, people wrote about what they did, but they were doing things and they knew they were wrong in a lot of cases. And please don't tell this to so-and-so because we'll get in trouble. So clearly knowing what they were doing was unethical. And again, that's the nature of our discipline. But I do think that we can now talk about it. We can have some accountability, perhaps. We need to talk about that knowledge, and I think bringing people in. And I think there's really great ways to do that. And this is just one of many ceremonies of transfers that we've done in the Duckworth. This is with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. I think we've learned a lot about the collections and the history of the treatment of the dead for the iwi kopuna, which are the ancestral remains, and I am grateful to the OHA folks for everything they've done and giving us more for our archive, actually. The UK has an institution called the Museums Association, and they're now starting to write about repatriation and restitution. There's a lot more in the public and professional arena around these things in the UK, and these are things that I have our students read and we talk about. And again, I like to just kind of alert them to different types of case studies. I think this is a fantastic article talking about actually, again, not everybody has the same, ethics, respect, dignity. They're all quite variable depending on where we're from, right? And so sometimes what works in the United States isn't going to work for folks in Mexico, let's say. Maybe what works in the UK isn't going to work here. But the point, and I like making sure that people understand that there's not just one narrative to follow. I do think about universals, and someone mentioned that earlier, and I think that's interesting. But this is a great article about how a community actually wants to show their dead. They want to engage with that. They've built their own museum, and why should they not? So I like to have different sides of the story, and I think what it all comes down to for me, I like to talk about these things in this way. I like to talk about aftercare. Whatever it is we're doing, how are we communicating our results with communities in a timely way? We should not have communities asking us 3 years down the road, hey, where are the results from the samples you took from our bodies? Or, where are the pigments that we sent you 5 years ago, and how come you haven't done anything with them? Now, look, I am, like I said, I'm the only full-time person for a massive collection. So I understand staffing issues. I understand priorities and time, and I understand underfunding. Believe me, I do. Conservation materials, are we providing conservation materials if communities are taking having a return of remains? Are we providing them any kind of conservation support if they need it? Maybe they don't. Maybe they have a fantastic museum back at home. But that's something I like to think about as well. And what did we learn together? I cannot believe how many people I know that still don't publish with the communities that they're working on or with. And I think that's really important. It's difficult, I know, especially with paying for translation and such things like that. But just having conversations and saying, right, what's the direction of this paper we want to go? And just engaging with each other more and presenting together and doing posters together. These are all things that I think are totally doable. And then I think about the afterlife. And look, like I said, I'm a death practitioner, so I'm always thinking about the afterlife. But is it publishable if sensitive remains or objects are the topic of your work? Are you working with secret and sacred remains? Should you be actually putting that on your Instagram account? Are you, same goes for presenting. So, publishing, presenting, what's going to happen? Once this all comes out, how is it going to be received in the country you've been working with? And that can also be local communities, because I do work with a lot of local communities in East Anglia from where I'm at. And people have various feelings about this. And does it do you undermine local specialists or patronize? That is also, and sometimes people don't mean to do it, but it does happen. We come in and we bring our archaeological teams to these other lands and we bulldoze in there, and then we sort of, are we working with local teams or not? This is probably old hat to you, I understand that. But I still feel like it needs to be said because I do still see it happening. And why not bring folks to your lab and teach them how, we just got a big grant and we welcomed several traditional owners from Australia and Papua New Guinea. We gave them a tour of our labs. We talked about the collections and we wanted to know, look, what would you like to do? They would like to do repatriation, but first, potentially, we might do some biomolecular work to essentially make an isoscape map for isotopic values in these countries. Now, it's all up to them, but I like the idea of saying, look, this is what's possible through scientific investigation. Would you like to come and learn how to do that in our labs, or do you have any other preference? Again, just have a conversation with people. It's really not that scary. We are trained, and that's what I'm talking about, right? I mean, I'm not scary, you guys. You can ask me anything. But we want to know, we as museum-y, collections-y persons, we want to know as much about the collection as we can, too. So when you take your research away, send it back, because we want those results. We want to build our archives, right? We want to make sure that people aren't doing sort of the same research over and over and over again, the same sampling. We want to support research. We want to grow our collections. That is not, there's this sort of vibe of the collections are all mine, 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 right? And the geneticists are like, don't you know who I am? I'm not having any of it. We have to work together. We have to, think about collections integrity. We need to think about collections transparency and accountability. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit zipped up here, but conclusion, you're doing really well, everyone. Knowledge is formed in many ways, and I feel truly, I think this is important. And again, you're all, I'm probably just telling you all the stuff you already know, but archives, historic records, oral histories, genealogy, archaeology, scientific analysis, we have so many wonderful things at our disposal. Why not try to, really branch out? Osteobiographies can represent the underrepresented in society. I think that's incredibly important as an osteoarchaeologist. Death is too important to ignore. This is something I'm really thinking a lot about, especially as more and more institutions are removing the dead from display. Now, it's not always ethical to display the dead. I agree with that. But when you go to museums that are celebrating human creativity through craft, right? Metalwork, paint, you're celebrating ingenuity, you're celebrating technology from humans. Well, death is actually a big part of that. You have ritual feasting, so therefore you have a relationship with what kind of food you're producing. You have ritual adornment, death adornment, so therefore you have a relationship with metals and beadwork and shells, and you have all of these connections. So to remove death out of that picture, to me, and it doesn't necessarily have to be displaying the dead, but I think there's a lot tied into that, and in the context and the way that you do it is so interesting, and I think it would be quite sad to remove that entirely. And when Nicholas brought up, he's right, with the pit rivers, when they removed those shrunken heads, there was a lot of fervor about it. I, as a board, a trustee at Babio, I got a lot of letters from people saying, you need to stop this. But what's actually happening is that Pit Rivers removed those remains, but they're actually working with the Shuar community about what they would like to see happen. They're actually doing sampling, destructive sampling on these shrunken heads because they want to do their own research, and they may put them back on display. So all you're really doing is just saying, hi, let's connect. Now what would you like to happen to the remains that are, I guess ancestral remains, if that's a term you use, because not everybody uses it. So again, I think, how is our research being viewed? Let social media activate you, but do your own work. This is something I tell my students in particular. And yeah, so I really appreciate, again, the invite, and I hope I've made some sense. And I've managed to sit still for the most part, sort of, but these are just some publications that I really enjoy. Okay, yes, I'm plugging my own book, but it was 607 pages of fun, let me tell you. So, but these are just some publications that I think are really helpful. And please contact me if you have questions. And I'm going to be quiet now.
I was wondering, I mean, I know this is right now an unpopular opinion, but I also think that maybe removing from display even this context of coming from colonization, no, is not a good idea always, because we tend to forget the things that are not pleasant, and we tend to not to look at that. So if we would just change the context, the narrative of it, I think it could be send very powerful message, because in the same way, like now we have again like rise of racism between young people because they don't know a lot about history. So having this kind of um, remains in a display, but in different kind of context, I think would be something that would really send different kind of message, because it's not the same if we tell a story or if you can see it.
Yes.
And in the same way, like we need to have Auschwitz, because this is the way how we'll learn of how horrible it was. You cannot just read it from the books. So I think in the same way, I wouldn't remove it completely. I would leave it, but I would completely change the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should. So are you in agreement with me not removing everything? I mean, I don't think we should remove I don't agree with that either. I mean, I don't want to see death removed and difficult subjects, and there are instances where so you mentioned Auschwitz. I mean, there are instances where they have cremated remains on display in some of these places, which are incredibly powerful. There was a lot of discussion about having some remains on display for the 9/11 memorial in the US, and there was a lot of, I do agree that I was just in Pompeii actually, visiting Valeria, and it was incredibly powerful, and I agree with you that we should be showing that. I think context is really important, and unfortunately, that is often lacking in a lot of places. Let's be honest. I mean, everywhere I go, anytime I go to new city, I'm looking at death stuff, right? And you see that where there's like no story at all. So, but I think in that case, I think what we do in the UK too, I think having a focus group. Now I know some people are like, focus group, more people, more cooks in the kitchen. We had that a lot where you bring in people from different backgrounds to talk it through. What are some of the concerns? Because for me, what I think about the most in those situations are the people who, what we call front of house in the institution. So all those gallery attendants, even people selling tickets to your institution, the people who the public see the most, they don't see the curators necessarily. They see those people. Those people need to be comfortable to talk about these. So if you're going to do these controversial, let's say controversial displays, let's just say, I mean, they're not always, but in my opinion, but let's just call them that. We need to also be thinking about how the public is going to engage and how the staff are going to respond. because that's where misinformation happens. And when people are emotional and saying, you shouldn't have this on, just, we need to protect our staff as well, especially front of house, who are making nothing compared to some of the other members of a institution. So I actually appreciate seeing human remains on display. I'm also quite critical about it, but if there's a mummy exhibition, I'm going to go. I'll be honest with you. I mean, that's me. So that's why I do worry about that, because now, and Nicholas had this slide up of this young man standing in his bone showroom, who is selling human remains but has now since moved it into a museum to teach the public about osteology. And he's giving a lot of misinformation, a lot of even wrong anatomical terminology, but he wants to make osteology accessible to the public. That is our job too. So if we remove all of the remains from our institutions, and I say this cautiously because if a community does not want that, then I do want, I have to think about that too. If they don't want it, then fine. Maybe we find some other collections to do that with. But I worry about this massive sale going on, and I worry about people like him who are spreading misinformation and who are representing osteology when actually, look at you, you're doing phenomenal work. You have but I think you have a really interesting social media presence, your lab school. You're trying to get that out to the public. That's our responsibility too, as academics, as practitioners, as scholars, instead of the guy who's selling a skeleton for $7,000. This troubles me deeply. Sorry, does that kind of relate to what you're asking me, though?
Yeah, but
I'm a little fired up from the election in the U.S. I'm sorry.
I was thinking, sometimes it's easier to remove things from display than to have unpleasant conversation.
Yes, that is exactly the point. And sorry, and that is something I talk about a lot, because I think I see a lot of institutions going, right, done, lock up the doors. That worries me. I think, why not have work with a community and see if they're cool with it too, to have these kinds of exhibits, because look, not everybody wants their ancestral remains off display either, or even refers to them again as ancestral remains. That's a very specific term. But I think, do stuff like that, and let's be honest about it. Let's talk about how there was a mass grave and a genocide, and people, as trophies on a wall, just like wild boar. Like, we need to talk about this stuff, because this is where our discipline has come from. This is where museum collecting has come from. So I think I agree with you, but I do also work with a lot of communities who find this incredibly distressing to see human remains on display. So I think it's never going to be resolved, but we have to have a balance. And I think just simply talking to one another actually can make people feel comfortable, make people feel less uncomfortable. Well, what can you tell me about these remains if you do this process? Just being, why is it so hard to you can be scientific, but you can speak from the heart. You can be nice, and we can do that. Again, I know I probably sound like a crazy Californian, and I'm owning it. I don't care, because I have had thousands of conversations with people about this stuff. So I think it's a great question, and I do worry about it. I don't want to see death is a remarkable ritual as well, and humans have been incredible with how they deal with it, and I think we need to talk about it. Does that sort of make sense?
Totally. I mean, there is no answer, but I was just sharing my thoughts on this topic.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. No, but I really enjoy this dialogue, because I think now there is a tendency just removing and okay, but then we will forget everything that happened, and we will not actually, I think it's take more courage to speak honestly and to be to expose, change the narrative, than just to remove it.
Yeah, and I do think about the hypocrisy. Somebody mentioned kind of this idea of hypocrisy too. I mean, look, the collection I manage wouldn't really be here in a lot of ways if it weren't for private collectors. The very same people that I'm now monitoring, who are buying human remains, but on the market or online or whatever, especially indigenous remains, once those remains get into private collections, they're never going to be repatriated, at least that we can engage with the communities, So it's not lost on me. Or if you make death plans, your family can test them. So really, I find this philosophically, this whole conversation about respect and dignity, it's so murky. And so there's very much a spectrum, from in situ burial, cremated remains, body parts, to whole mummy, whole bodies and things like that, display. I find it rather fascinating.
No,
All right,
but
I'm gonna stop.
I'm totally against private collections, obviously, but the museums are actually, but it's also very hard to prevent completely. But the museums are the one that are actually telling the story. So it's very depending of how
Yeah.
the story will be told.
Yeah, of course, it's gonna work differently everywhere, but they gave me a microphone, so I'm taking it.
I think I'm also overusing, sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi. I think here we are overlapping several issues on ethics, but also on the politics of exhibiting collections, and especially in relation to colonial and post-colonial issues, and how the narratives of these collections should be presented to the public, not only in relation to the original communities, but also today's society, European society. So in a way, I agree also that it's not the best thing to just remove the collections from the public, but also to exhibit, and that's about narratives, how to exhibit to the public today, not only in relation to the original communities, but to European communities, declaring how we treat this material. So recognizing our colonial past, our colonial narratives.
Yeah.
And this is also in relation how we transform cultural, and that's in relation to the Italian speaker who was talking about bieni culturali and heritage. So we treat these objects from other cultures as objects, where these people are approaching to this as their relatives. So these different narratives of what is heritage and how we put this heritage into exhibition is also something that is beyond the ethics of the osteology itself.
Yes. I agree with you, and that's why I look into things like axiology and just other ways of thinking and knowing, but yeah, thank you. There wasn't a question, right? You were just comment. Okay, cool, because I missed
Just an observation, two overlapping.
Right on, thank you. Thanks for sharing.